Good afternoon, everybody. This is Bonnie Vandermeulen, Training Coordinator for Wisconsin Facets. Our webinar today is Intellectual Disabilities, Information for Parents. And as your screen says, moving to intellectual disabilities in Wisconsin. It is my pleasure today to introduce our presenter to you. Molly Beaver is a consultant for intellectual disabilities on the special education team at the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction. She also works with the Office of Student Assessment on the alternate assessment, the dynamic learning maps. Prior to working for the department, Molly taught special education for the Prescott School District in northwestern Wisconsin. It's my pleasure today to introduce to you our presenter, Molly Beaver. Molly?
Hi, thank you for joining us today. Just as a reminder, feel free to type your questions in the chat box. We'll have plenty of time at the end of the presentation to answer those questions. Like Bonnie said, my name is Molly Beaver, and I'm the Intellectual Disability Consultant for the Department of Public Instruction. Today I'm going to be talking about changes to the PI 11.361 statute regarding terminology for intellectual disabilities. So as of September 1st, 2015, so this is the second school year rather, we have new terminology and a revised definition and criteria for those students who might be qualifying for services under the category of intellectual disabilities. On October 5th, 2010, Rosa's Law was signed at a federal level. This mandated that any state using the term mental retardation had to change their terminology to intellectual disability. In 2010, Wisconsin was using the term cognitive disability, so we were not required to change. In the summer of 2013, Wisconsin decided to pursue changing our current terminology to reflect the current research and joined 40 other states that had already made the change to using the term intellectual disabilities. Over the last 10 years, the researchers with the American Association on Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities developed new guidance as a result of their research regarding eligibility criteria and definition. So as Wisconsin began looking into changing our terminology from cognitive disability to intellectual disability, it seemed to be an appropriate time to also examine current research and apply it to our own eligibility criteria and definition within our own state. We started by bringing a task force comprised of special education directors, special education teachers, school psychologists, parent groups, program support teachers, and other important stakeholders in the field of intellectual disabilities together in the summer of 2013. From there, we developed a scope and proposed rules. Then we had a hearing, delivered the proposed rules to the legislature, and as of September 1st, 2015, our final rule took effect. Throughout this PowerPoint, you will find new language in red. Language that has stayed the same will be in green. There are also side-by-sides throughout the PowerPoint to help illustrate the change from the old to the new rule. The old language will be on your left, while the new language is going to be on your right. A primary source for information in the field of intellectual disabilities is from the American Association on Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities manual that I already have and will continue to reference throughout this presentation. It is currently in its 11th edition and is a primary source for information and research in the field of intellectual disabilities. I would recommend either you could check it out at your local library, or Amazon has them used. It does have a lot of information, and it's not just from school-aged 3 through 21. It's actually through the lifetime of a person with an intellectual or developmental disabilities. So it does cover birth through death and has a lot of information, and they are considered the leader in terms of information and research. So those of you who may have students or children who were previously identified as cognitive disability, the language is now intellectual disability. There's no testing that needs to be done to change it. It just automatically changes from cognitive to intellectual disability, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through. So the new terminology is intellectual disability. To help illustrate the changes, here is a side-by-side. On the right-hand side, you see the new definition, and on the left-hand side, you see the old definition. Our new definition states intellectual disability means significant limitations both in intellectual functioning and in adaptive behavior as expressed in conceptual, social, and practical adaptive skills and manifested during the developmental period that adversely affects the child's educational performance. We have revised the definition to reflect some of the current understanding and research completed over the last 10 years. We have changed the term significant subaverage to significant limitations. We have embraced the AAIDD change to 3 adaptive areas to be all-inclusive of the previous 10 areas. We have in current legislation now adaptive behavior can be expressed in conceptual, social, and practical adaptive skills. You may remember in the old rule, the old definition, there was 10. Those 10 areas are now fit into these 3 areas, and when we get to the adaptive section, I will show you how they fit into the new 3 areas. We also have included in the definition the developmental period that had previously been in a note at the end of the old rule. The language manifested during the developmental period has also been added to the definition. So what does that language actually mean? This statement refers to the period during which ID or intellectual disability first originates. As defined in the AAIDD manual, the age of onset is prior to 18. That's on page 93 in case you'd like to read more about that. The eligibility criteria has not changed. The eligibility criteria continues to use 3 areas for identifying students as having an intellectual disability: intellectual functioning, adaptive behavior, and educational performance. However, you might want to note that we changed academic functioning to educational performance to mirror the terminology that AAIDD currently uses. Now we can talk about each criteria area in more depth. Again, here is the slide that we should have to show you the comparison between the old and the new rule for your reference. You will find the old criteria on the left-hand side and the new criteria on the right-hand side. The language for intellectual functioning states that the child has a standard score of 2 or more standard deviations below the mean on at least one individually administered intelligence test. This part has stayed the same, which takes into account the child's mode of communication and is developed to assess intellectual functioning using this mode. More than one intelligence test may be used to produce a comprehensive result. I would like to point out the changes that have been made under intellectual functioning. The first change is to take into account the child's mode of communication when assessing their intellectual functioning. The second change is that specific language has been added to that states more than one intelligence test may be used to produce a comprehensive result. It is worth noting that we believe that many practitioners in the field have already been doing this, but actually when we included parents in our stakeholder involvement, they wanted it explicitly stated. An additional change to note is that the language around reevaluation has been removed from this section. We will discuss that more later in the presentation. I do want to note that in the area of intellectual functioning is perhaps where I receive my most calls and questions from the field, usually school psychologists, asking about what might happen if they are unable to yield a valid or reliable IQ score. I recently worked with Catherine Bush, who is the school psychologist consultant here at the Department of Public Instruction, and we developed a draft worksheet that IEP teams might be able to utilize if that is a concern. So if you find yourself in that situation, please feel free to contact either her or myself, and we would be happy to direct you to that. Again, here is a side-by-side for the adaptive behavior section. The old criteria is on the left-hand side and the new is on the right-hand side. When you are looking at assessing a child for an intellectual disability, the adaptive behavior portion is what you really want to look at critically. The language for this part of the adaptive behavior has stayed the same. The child has significant limitations in adaptive behavior that are demonstrated by a standard score of 2 or more standard deviations below the mean on standardized or nationally normed measures as measured by comprehensive individual assessments that include interviews of the parents, tests and observations of the child in adaptive behavior which are relevant to the child's age, including at least one of the following. And here is where the rule has changed. Conceptual skills, social adaptive skills, practical adaptive skills, or an overall composite score on a standardized measure of conceptual, social, and practical skills. Please note that while the areas have changed, we are continuing with the language that states assessments that include interviews with parents and observations of the child which are relevant to the child's age. We have moved from 10 areas to these 3 more all-encompassing areas. You may remember a while back we originally had 3 areas that were very similar to what we have now, but then AAIDD researchers felt that the 3 areas were too broad and didn't do an adequate job at pinpointing areas of concern. So we moved to the 10 more specific areas that you may be more familiar with. After completing more research, those at the AAIDD found that the 10 areas were in fact too narrow, and so they've moved back to these 3 more all-encompassing areas. The most recent AAIDD manual user guide on page 64 defines adaptive behavior as the collection of conceptual, social, and practical skills that have been learned and are performed by people in their everyday lives. The consensus, based on considerable published research, is that the adaptive behavior is multidimensional and includes conceptual, social adaptive, practical adaptive skills. As we continue, I will show you how those 10 areas fit into our 3 areas. Conceptual skills include language, both expressive and receptive, reading and writing, money, time, and number concepts. Social adaptive skills include interpersonal skills, social responsibility, self-esteem, avoiding gullibility, vulnerability or being tricked or manipulated, following rules and obeying laws, age victimization, and social problem solving. You might have noticed that some of these skills do not necessarily seem like skills we're talking about for school-age children. This is because we use the AAIDD manual to cover the world of intellectual disabilities, birth through adulthood, so they address a broad range of skills. In the area of practical adaptive skills, it includes activities of daily living like eating, mobility, toileting, dressing, instrumental activities of daily living, meal preparation, housekeeping, using public transportation, taking medication, managing money, using the telephone, occupational skills, and maintaining safe environments. Here you can see the crosswalk of how the 10 old areas fit into our new 3 areas in adaptive behavior. This crosswalk will be helpful to you if you are using an adaptive measure that still breaks down the various areas into the 10 areas of our prior definition. Usually assessments of adaptive behavior come in the form of a rater skills form that a parent fills out, a teacher fills out, and perhaps somebody in the community if the student attends daycare or a work facility. And those forms may still break out into scores into the 10 areas. And so at IEP meetings, this would be useful to know which one of those 10 areas fits into the new three areas of adaptive behavior. Conceptual skills include communication, applying academics and self-direction. Social adaptive skills includes social skills and self-direction. Practical adaptive skills includes self-care skills, home living, appropriate use of resources in the community, health and safety, leisure, and work. Here is the side-by-side for academic functioning for children 3 to 5. The language from the old rule is on the left-hand side, and the language from the new rule is on the right-hand side. The first part of the language has stayed the same. The child is aged 3 through 5 and has a standard score of 2 or more standard deviations below the mean on standardized or nationally normed measures as measured by comprehensive individual assessments. And here's where the language has changed. Language development and communication, and cognition and general knowledge. We have changed the areas of educational performance assessed for this criteria. These follow more closely the model early learning academic standards and include language development and communication and cognition and general knowledge. This is meant to be 2 areas and students need to be 2 standard deviations below the mean in both of those areas. Please note that the motor skills has been removed from the language and is in this part of the rule. Wisconsin is only a handful of states, or one of only a handful of states that have specific guidelines for assessing educational performance, and the only state that breaks it down into 2 separate age brackets for 3 to 5 and then for 6 to 21. Most states have a general statement for 3 to 21. Historically, we have always had a more robust educational performance section, and when we talked about changing it to mirror perhaps more what other states do, stakeholders felt we should continue to have this piece a part of our criteria. When we are talking about language development and communication, it is referring to a child's understanding of language and the use of language. It encompasses all forms of communication, both verbal and nonverbal, and perhaps most importantly, moves children along the continuum of early literacy. So, language development and communication includes language that may be spoken, sign language, gesture, or other symbolic means of communication such as pictures. Conceptual language development occurs over time, and children are able to demonstrate conceptual language development as they age. Here's the side-by-side for educational performances for ages 6 to 21. As I said, our state breaks the 2 apart. The first part of the language has stayed the same. The child is age 6 through 21 and has a standard score of 2 or more standard deviations below the mean on standardized or nationally normed measures as measured by comprehensive individual assessments in the following areas. And this is the portion that has changed. Written language, reading, and mathematics. Really the only part that changed is the and. The old rule used to say or. And so you had to have 2 of the 3 areas. And so we've changed the criteria so that you must meet 2 standard deviations below all 3 areas. In the area of educational performance, new language has been added so that we will be able to assess those students that can't be assessed through the usual means. You may only use this option when the child cannot be tested and only in the area of educational performance. When they're talking about under section 3A or B, that is, I'll just back up here and show you. Part A is the educational performance. You can see here, this is the education part A, and then part B is ages 6 through 21. So this would be part B. Sorry if that gave whiplash as I paged back. As you note in the rule, body of evidence is only for educational performance. This is because you can do intellectual testing in all cases. The department feels that in that case, all children should be tested. And the adaptive behavior, like I mentioned before, is measured using a checklist that adults complete. So body of evidence and informal measures may include, but are not limited to, criterion referenced assessments, developmental skills checklists, anecdotal records, observations focused on academic achievement, records from previous service, and other medical providers. Here's a side-by-side for reevaluation. The old language is on the left, and there's nothing across from it because on the bottom is the new language. There's nothing behind it because this is, like I said, new language. It's not really compared to much. This new language was added to assist in reevaluations. The section serves two purposes. One is so that a student originally assessed as having a cognitive disability will now be considered a student with an intellectual disability. For purposes of reporting, the department automatically changed CD to ID. So in all of our databases, students who were coded as CD automatically went to ID, and that was updated earlier this year, or 2016, since it's a new year. The second purpose is for 3-year evaluation purposes. You will need to answer 3 questions during the reevaluation process. Was the child initially found to have an intellectual disability, or in some cases cognitive disability? Does this child continue to demonstrate a need for special education services? And does this child continue to need specially designed instruction? If the IEP team can answer yes to all 3 of these questions, then the child continues to be a child with an intellectual disability. You will not need to test at the 3-year reevaluation unless the IEP team deems it necessary to do so. There is a reevaluation checklist that goes over the 3 questions that I just spoke with you about, and you can find that on the DPI's ID webpage. It's not a required form, but it was rather created to help IEP teams as a tool for discussion if necessary. This is another thing that I wanted to speak with you about, as it might be, ESSA was just reauthorized shortly, and one of the rules that changed was regarding large-scale assessment. Our terminology says intellectual disability, and when we're talking about large-scale assessment, they use the federal term is significant cognitive disability. So although we have changed from CD to ID for purposes of identifying students to receive special education services, the federal language related to state standards and assessment, which was previous ESEA, now it's ESSA, continues to use the terminology significant cognitive disability when describing students who participate in alternate standards and assessment. The term significant cognitive disability under ESSA has different criteria and meaning, and includes students other than those identified as having an intellectual disability, including autism, TBI, OHI, and then also perhaps ID. One note that I wanted to make you aware of is that just because a student has an intellectual disability does not automatically mean they're a student with the most significant cognitive disability and should be participating in the alternate assessment and alternate standards. It is perfectly plausible and happens quite often that a student with an intellectual disability participates in the general universal curriculum and standards with modifications and supports. This might be something that is happening in IEP meetings as the year progresses. The new rule under ESSA states that only 1% of a state's population should be participating in the alternate assessment. As a state, we sit just over 1% at about 1.2 to 1.3%. Individual districts range from 0% up through 6%. Some districts are legitimately over the 1% because they have a low N size. So for example, I taught in a district that in some cases one student would put us over 1%, even though that student really should be participating in the alternate assessment. Just know that IEP teams may be discussing how a student fits into the alternate assessment, alternate standards now that the criteria has changed. And just know that just because a student is identified as having an intellectual disability does not automatically mean they're a student with the most significant cognitive disability, and that there's a difference. Of course, if you have questions about that, you can always call myself or Kristen Burton with the Office of Student Assessment. We are both working on that project and would be more than happy to talk with you about that. Here are some resources for you. I provided a link to the actual rule, the law. I provided a link to the eligibility checklist for intellectual disabilities and also a link to the reevaluation checklist that I spoke about. I do have a listserv. It was originally intended for program support teacher announcement list. It's for special education teachers, but I do send out information monthly about community transition supports, tips. I have a special education transition teacher who contributes to that monthly on different tips when planning for transition for students with intellectual disabilities. And I also provide updates on IEPs and other information, so feel free to email me. It's really a list for anybody. You don't have to be a teacher to be a part of it, and that comes out the first week of every month that school is in session. For more information, feel free to contact me at my email, or you can call also. And that's all I have for you today.
Does anyone have any questions for Molly at this time? Because we have none typed in our question box. If you do have a question, we'll take a minute or two to wait to see if anyone does have a question for you, Molly. I don't see any other questions at this time. I'd like to thank you, Molly, for your presentation today. I think it was very informative, and I'm sure that the people who have participated also believe so. Thank you, everybody. This concludes our webinar for today. We appreciate you joining us. We have over 100 scheduled trainings and webinars for Wisconsin Facets for 2017. Please feel free to check out our website calendar and register for any upcoming trainings that you might be interested in. Also, please watch for the short evaluation that will be coming your way in approximately an hour. Have a great rest of the day, everybody. And again, thank you so much, Molly, for your participation today.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.